has seen explosive growth and is a leader in fintech on many fronts. You perhaps have seen a lot of statistics. We have seen, number of users, 500 million. That's not surprising because of the population base. But the market value reached about 15 trillion at the end of 2015. Subsegments like P2P, third-party payments, wealth management. I'm sure you have seen the numbers. It's impressive. Lately, we also have seen Ant Financial raise $14 billion and has a private market value of $150 billion. Right. So all these have been well received by capital markets as well. We have the largest number of fintech unicorns. So I think investors, economy, the consumers have benefited tremendously from this, what we call inclusive finance. Yes. But come with this growth, we also have a lot of risk to be managed. So I think in your view, we know that some of the risks are relevant for all the financial services companies. Some are unique to fintech companies. So I'd like to hear your view on, what are some of these risks we got to watch out for and what are the proper way of measuring them.
Yeah, so definitely I've seen a lot of these discussions about this tremendous growth in this area. The first thing that people kind of mention to me whenever I come back to China is just how much more convenient than last time, these kind of mobile payments, right. Cashless economy and so on. So it's very impressive. I think in terms of the risks that I would like to think about, at least as a financial economist, I like to think about them from perhaps maybe three different perspectives. So one is thinking about the consumers, consumer protection. Because, these, like you mentioned, this is inclusive finance. So necessarily it's bringing in, consumers who previously had not been having access to finance as a result are particularly kind of quote unquote undereducated in terms of finance. So I think how to make sure they understand, what they're getting into, right? You mentioned, for example, P2P lending is a good example of this, as well as many of these wealth management products that are made much more accessible through, internet finance and mobile interfaces. How to make sure they understand what they're investing in, to sort of educate them about this sort of not having the belief that these products are absolutely safe, as this notion that governments always going to stand behind them is kind of a misconceived but very widely held belief by many of these customers. I think that's something that we should do a lot about in terms of making sure that there's well communicated messages to these consumers, as well as expose making sure they are indeed protected in a kind of legal and consistent way. That's one thing I think is important to mention from the consumer side. From the firm's perspective, I think a lot of the tremendous growth you mentioned are backed by very interesting technologies. So in fact, I teach analytics of finance course in finance, talking at MIT, exactly talking about this. But I think what's perhaps less appreciated is many of these kind of technology, for example, lending decisions entirely based on computer algorithms. They might seem very convenient and in fact effective. They oftentimes have unintended consequences that we as economists like to sort of pay more attention to. So there, I think that's another area that potentially will be risks coming up. I'd be happy to go into more of that if interested.
Let me just follow up on that. Some of the successes in emerging markets, especially in China, can be credited to I can't say it's lack of regulation, but it's more of government support, or the regulations are less on these new startups, on the internet technology firms, on the fintech firms. So we all know that consumer protections are important, financial stability is important, sustainability of this growth is extremely important from the central government, from the financial system perspective. So I think everybody agrees that we need to have certain regulations. So the regulation arbitrage is not going to be there forever. But we all know as economists, as finance professionals, that regulations are all well-intended, but they all have unintended consequences, and they're usually late. They're usually late. So what are your suggestions? Because it's a fine balance to strike. Too much regulation, you stifle the industry, right? Not enough, then we run into problem of consumer protection, instability of financial system, or the P2P crackdowns that we saw on the Chinese P2P platforms. If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. So specifically on the regulation side, I think I'm of the view that consistency and somewhat of a predictability of regulation is important. Whereas in reality, we oftentimes see, like you mentioned, right? At first, maybe the regulatory environment is very much fostering the fast growth of these fintech entrepreneurial activities. But oftentimes, when we see things start swinging too far to the other end, then all of a sudden there's going to be pretty drastic regulatory changes. I think that actually, from a point of view like system stability, is not necessarily the best thing to do. If anything, my advice would be actually to have more of a kind of a transparent and consistent message for both the for every party involved in this, including firms, investors, customers, to understand what is kind of the regulatory goal in terms of overall stability, welfare, and growth in the economy, but not in terms of switching back and forth the regulatory stand in such a drastic manner. I think that's perhaps the most worrisome thing.
I totally agree. I think a lot of that also depends on we understand the nature of the risk. Right?
Absolutely.
So like here in China, people are more willing to share their data. But some of the new developments, the credit risk or the security is not going to be based on financial data. It's going to be based on your social media footprints.
Right.
But who owns these data, right? Are you willing to share these data? After living in the States for decades, coming here, I do feel the difference. People here are not as willing to share the data. And we know some of the successes big data, AI, depending on people willing to share data. So what is your view or suggestion on data protection, privacy, and also, data protection, privacy, ownership, all these issues that will come up.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's already come up. As most recently, the famous example.
I think here is also coming up slowly.
Facebook is this most recent successful, famous example of this issue. Right. Absolutely. I would probably, change the perspective a little bit in thinking about the data issue. In many senses, given the kind of environment the Chinese economy is positioned in, I think the issue perhaps is not so much about whether the consumers are willing to share this type of information or not, but rather, I think from a regulated point of view, there needs to be more of a sort of holistic thinking about what kind of information should indeed be involved in this kind of sort of smart algorithms. Right? So that's what I kind of hinted at earlier. Let me give you kind of a more concrete example of this. Right? So, for example, if like a big data lender wants to lend out extend credit to small businesses based on some of these what we call alternative data that they can collect, right? From example, from social media, from people's educational backgrounds and other kind of footprints they have in the economy. It is actually not so hard to find kind of information or kind of characteristics that can be very predictive of the outcome of the loan, right? So whether the person can default or not, for example, probably depends on, not depends, but is strongly correlated with things like, their social status, where they grow up, what's kind of the economic environment they came from. But, if you make your lending decisions based on this, it could very well, generate some kind of a full self-fulfilling kind of feedback circle. So what I mean by that is, if you, for example, think of someone who came from a social disadvantaged background, and as a result, based on historical data, this is the type of group of people who tend to have harder problem paying back their loans. And now we're basing our, lending decisions based on exactly these characteristics. Well, guess what we're going to find out? Going to find out these people are going to have a harder time, getting their credit access. And as a result, it's not surprising they will indeed be more likely to default.
And then the inclusive finance will not become inclusive.
Exactly. So you can exactly be moving in the opposite direction of that, actually. So what you did in the end, if you just blindly trust in these kind of algorithm, is that you're going to be more sort of finely screening people as opposed to actually expanding the frontier of the credit access.
So my next question, or what I'd like for us to think about is, payments is perhaps the most mature segment of the fintech. But what's next? What's the next big thing? We talked about AI, we talked about big data. In the States, we talk about high frequency trading, trading millisecond, nanosecond. What is it? Where is the next revolutionary innovation going to come from? And why do you think they're significant?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I got asked about that a lot from the students. One thing I think that has a lot of potential, even though it's still ongoing, but it still has a lot of potential, is basically how to bring in alternative data. We have already had quite a bit of success using, building algorithms based on what is considered conventional form of data, right? The data that you can actually easily convert into numbers and then be crunched by the computers. But there's actually, increasingly so, in fact, alternative to forms of data. For example, text. The financial statements, newspaper articles, social media. Increasingly, firms are developing, technology and team, people who have this kind of proper skills to try to crunch this type of data and getting useful information out of them. I think that's going to be ongoing and keep expanding in terms of the potential applications, and we see more of the value of that as well. You mentioned, for example, in investment, world, quantitative investing nowadays.
Algo trading, right?
Algo trading is definitely one, but even in terms of the more fundamental sort of equity analyst kind of functions, we're seeing them are increasingly being replaced or at least being outpaced by the kind of growth in terms of smart algorithms analyzing the data in a more automatic fashion and faster picking up this kind of news events.
Have you seen the CNBC sort of a news brief after earnings report? It's generated by machine. It's automatically generated. It will tell you, EPS is this number.
That's right.
Target is this number. It's dry, but you got most of the information there.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see even more of that, right? So that's kind of the starting point of this. Later on, it wouldn't surprise me at all if you start seeing, these kind of IPO documents, roadshow documents are being
so
replaced.
Investment bankers will be out of their job.
At least, if you wanted to become an investment banker, the kind of jobs you're going to be doing the first couple of years, not going to be copy and pasting, document templates anymore, but rather something perhaps more sophisticated and more meaningful, which is a good thing, I think.
Interestingly, another area is wealth management.
Yes.
So we know that in the States, at least Fortune 500 companies in the 90s, early 2000 offer people defined benefits. So you don't have to worry about it. But now only 20% of the firms of Fortune 500 offer defined benefit or pensions, so-called, to their new hires. So it's tremendous pressure on these young people to manage their retirement, which is going to be, I don't know, with the life expectancy extending maybe 80 years, right, from the entering workforce. So, we talked about robot advisors, right? They're going to make wealth management more accessible, more customized, cheaper. That's the most important thing, right? It's cheaper because otherwise, these people, a lot of these young professionals we call hairy, right? High earning but not rich yet.
That's right.
Even them, they don't have access to wealth management, to advisors. But with all these development, I'm excited to see, how they're going to do, right? You probably remember all these examples in the 80s, right? We throw darts in picking stocks versus stock analysts. So this will be a new competition, I hope. Star advisors versus robot advisors.
Yeah, I think this concept of robot advisors actually is very much kind of consistent with the trend in the investment community we're seeing, right? Increasingly moving away from active management, more into passive, efficient portfolios, like smart beta is one of the
smart
important
beta,
concepts
ETFs, right? I've seen the growth of that.
Yeah.
Right.
So I definitely see a lot of potential there, although the robot advisor kind of space
it's still new, right?
Yeah, still new and growing kind of slowly, but I think, to the extent they can team up with this concept of defined contribution and retirement savings, the potential is really, really enormous, I think.
But I am also thinking about, ultimately, hopefully human or financial professionals, the right intellectual minds, whether they are the data scientists or finance professionals, can tell the computer what to do, right? Even for the asset allocation model, we just talked about the target fund. You still need to feed in the inputs.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So I think we're not totally out of the picture, right? We still have to make decisions on, what time horizon to look at, what type of data input are appropriate, right? Because what we feed into the machine is going to be determining what we get out of this algorithm. Yeah, so it's a learning process. I think the machine learning and the big data will help in terms of accuracy, effectiveness of these algorithms.
Yeah, that's completely true. That's a great point. These algorithms are as good as the kind of the objectives you give them. If you give them the wrong objective, you can get garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, absolutely.